The crowded cafe fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the corner table where James stood, his daughter's small hand in his. The woman's words hung in the air like smoke. What happened next would change everything, not just for James, but for everyone watching. If you've ever faced a moment where the perfect response meant everything, hit that like button. And subscribe to see more stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it matters most. James Matthews hadn't planned on becoming a single father at 32. But life rarely follows our carefully constructed blueprints, does it? 3 years ago, his wife Eliza had kissed him goodbye one ordinary Tuesday morning. Don't forget, parent-teacher conference at 4, she'd reminded him, adjusting his slightly crooked tie. By noon, she was gone, a delivery truck, a rainy intersection, a moment's distraction. The police officer who came to James's office spoke in gentle tones that somehow made the news even more unbearable. In the aftermath, James learned to navigate a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty simultaneously. He learned to braid his daughter Sophie's hair, YouTube tutorials at midnight, to pack lunches with little notes inside, just as Eliza had done, and to answer impossible questions like, "When is mommy coming back?" with a steadiness he didn't feel. Sophie was 6 now, with her mother's hazel eyes and curious nature. She'd inherited James's quiet determination and analytical mind. Together, they formed a small but mighty team, figuring out this new life one day at a time. "Daddy, can we go to Riverside Cafe after my dance class?" Sophie had asked that morning, her voice muffled as she pulled her favorite purple sweater over her head. "Miss Lily says they have the best hot chocolate in the whole wide world." James smiled, helping her untangle an arm from the sleeve. "The whole wide world? That's quite a claim. I guess we'll have to investigate." He hadn't expected the cafe to be so crowded on a Thursday afternoon. The warm lighting and exposed brick walls created an atmosphere that drew people in from the November chill. Students hunched over laptops, couples leaned toward each other across small tables, and the baristas called out orders with practiced efficiency. Sophie bounced on her toes beside him in line. "Can I get whipped cream on top? And chocolate sprinkles?" "Let's not go overboard," James laughed, scanning the menu board. "One sugar rush is enough for today." "But Daddy, it's a special occasion," Sophie insisted, her expression suddenly serious. "Oh? What's the occasion?" "We're trying the best hot chocolate in the whole wide world," she explained, as if it were obvious. "That doesn't happen every day." James couldn't argue with that logic. "Fair point. Whipped cream it is." They placed their order, 1 hot chocolate with whipped cream and sprinkles, 1 black coffee, and moved to the pickup counter. While they waited, Sophie spotted an empty table by the window and tugged at James's sleeve. "Can I go save our spot? Please. I'll be super careful." James hesitated. The table was only 15 feet away, clearly visible from where he stood. Sophie was becoming more independent lately, asking for small freedoms that both made him proud and terrified him. "Okay, but sit right down and don't talk to strangers," he said, watching as she carefully navigated between tables. "I know, Daddy," she called back, rolling her eyes in that new way she'd picked up from her slightly older friends at school. James was still smiling when he felt someone move beside him at the counter. A woman with copper hair and a confident smile glanced at him, then at Sophie, who was arranging her dance bag on the chair across from her chosen seat. "Cute kid," the woman said. "Yours?" "Yes, thank you," James replied politely, keeping one eye on Sophie. "I'm Vanessa," she continued, extending a manicured hand. "I haven't seen you here before, and I'm something of a regular." James shook her hand briefly. "James. And no, first time here. My daughter's dance teacher recommended it." "Smart teacher," Vanessa said, leaning slightly closer. "The coffee is excellent, but the company might be even better." There was no mistaking her tone or the way her eyes lingered on him. James felt a familiar discomfort rise. This wasn't the first time someone had shown interest since Eliza died, but he still hadn't figured out how to navigate these waters gracefully. "Hot chocolate with extra whipped cream and sprinkles," the barista called out. "That's us," James said, grateful for the interruption. "Nice meeting you." But Vanessa wasn't deterred. She followed him to the pickup counter, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral. "You know," she said, lowering her voice as he reached for the drinks, "you have that look about you." James raised an eyebrow. "What look is that?" She smiled and leaned in, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You seem great in bed. It's something in the way you move, how careful you are. The quiet ones always surprise you." The comment hit him like a physical blow. James froze, acutely aware of the people around them who had fallen silent, of Sophie sitting just a few tables away, of the hot drinks in his hands that suddenly felt too heavy. 3 years of single parenthood had taught James many things. How to function on minimal sleep. How to hold space for a child's grief while managing his own. How to be both mother and father when necessary. But perhaps most importantly, it had taught him the power of thoughtful response over immediate reaction. He took a deliberate breath and met Vanessa's eyes directly. "You know what's great?" he said, his voice calm but carrying in the hushed café. "Reading bedtime stories until little eyes grow heavy. Checking for monsters under the bed and making shadow puppets on the wall. Sitting beside a child with a fever at 3 in the morning, counting each breath. That's what I'm great at." He glanced toward Sophie, who was watching them curiously. "I'm a father before I'm anything else," he continued. "And the only person whose opinion matters to me is sitting right over there, waiting for her hot chocolate to cool down enough to drink." Without waiting for a response, James nodded politely and walked away, leaving Vanessa standing at the counter. He could feel the eyes of other patrons following him as he crossed to Sophie's table and set down their drinks. "Who was that lady, Daddy?" Sophie asked, reaching eagerly for her hot chocolate. "Just someone being friendly," James said, helping her arrange the napkin. "Careful, it's hot." Sophie blew across the surface of her drink, creating tiny ripples in the whipped cream. "She looked surprised when you walked away." James smiled. "Sometimes people are surprised when they don't get the reaction they expect. Like when I thought Mr. Wilson would be mad about the ball breaking his window, but he just helped us fix it instead." "Something like that," James nodded, impressed by her connection. "People can surprise you." As they sat enjoying their drinks, James noticed something unexpected happening around them. An elderly woman at the next table caught his eye and nodded approvingly. A young man studying nearby gave him a subtle thumbs up. The barista who had served them placed a plate with a chocolate chip cookie on their table. "On the house," she said with a warm smile. "For the best dad in the café." Sophie's eyes widened. "See, Daddy? I told you it was a special occasion." James laughed, feeling something loosen in his chest. For 3 years, he'd been so focused on what he and Sophie had lost that he sometimes forgot to notice what they'd built together. A life that was different than planned, yes, but still full of meaning and small joys. As they finished their drinks, a young woman approached their table hesitantly. She looked about 20, with nervous eyes and a tentative smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I just wanted to say thank you." James looked at her, confused. "For what?" "My dad raised me alone after my mom left when I was 4, she explained. He never dated, always said I was his priority. I used to think he was sacrificing too much, but hearing you just now." She paused, blinking rapidly. "I'm going to call him tonight and thank him properly." After she walked away, Sophie looked at her father curiously. "Why did that girl thank you, Daddy?" James considered how to explain. "Sometimes when we make choices that feel right to us, it helps other people feel good about their choices too." Sophie nodded sagely, a smear of chocolate on her upper lip. Like when I chose the purple sweater and then Emma decided purple was her favorite color too? Exactly like that, James smiled, reaching across to wipe her mouth with a napkin. As they gathered their things to leave, James noticed Vanessa still at the counter. Their eyes met briefly, and to his surprise, she gave him a small, respectful nod. Perhaps something in his words had reached her too. Outside, the afternoon had turned golden, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Sophie skipped ahead a few steps, then turned back to wait for him. "Daddy," she said thoughtfully, "was Miss Lily right about the hot chocolate?" James pretended to consider this seriously. "Well, I didn't taste it myself." "Was it the best in the whole wide world?" Sophie giggled. "Maybe not the whole world. But definitely the best in our world." James felt his heart swell as he took her small hand in his. "Our world is pretty special, isn't it?" "The specialist," Sophie agreed, swinging their joined hands as they walked. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, James sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the photograph on his nightstand, Eliza laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight in her hair. For the first time in a long while, the sight didn't bring that sharp pain of absence. Instead, he felt a gentle warmth, a sense of continuity. "She's so much like you," he whispered to the photograph. "Brave and kind and too smart for her own good sometimes." He thought about the café, about Vanessa's comment and his response, about the unexpected connections that had formed in that moment. For years, he'd been defining himself by what he'd lost. Today had reminded him of all he still was. A father. A protector. A man with values and boundaries. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "This is Lily, Sophie's dance teacher. Hope you don't mind, but one of the other dance moms was at Riverside Cafe today and told me what happened. Just wanted to say that Sophie is lucky to have you. See you at next week's class." James set the phone down, surprised by the tears that suddenly blurred his vision. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, that he was enough, that he was doing right by Sophie, that their little two-person family was whole in its own way. Outside Sophie's room, he paused to listen to her soft, even breathing. Then he gently pushed the door open and stood watching her sleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant Eliza had given her. In that moment, James understood something fundamental. The greatest acts of love aren't always dramatic rescues or grand gestures. Sometimes, they're as simple as knowing who you are and standing firmly in that truth. Sometimes, they're about showing your child that their presence in your life isn't a burden but a privilege. And sometimes, they're about finding the right words in a crowded cafe when it would be easier to say nothing at all. The story of James and Sophie didn't end that day at Riverside Cafe. In many ways, it was just beginning. Over the following months and years, that moment would ripple outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. The cafe became their regular Saturday spot. The barista who had given them the free cookie, her name was Mia, always greeted Sophie by name and remembered her order. The elderly woman from the next table turned out to be a retired elementary school teacher who eventually became Sophie's cherished tutor and friend. And Vanessa? She appeared at the cafe one afternoon 6 months later, approaching their table with a different kind of confidence. "I owe you an apology," she said directly to James. "What I said that day was inappropriate and disrespectful." James nodded, appreciating her directness. "Thank you for saying that. Your response stayed with me," she continued. "It made me think about how I interact with people, what I value." She glanced at Sophie, who was absorbed in her drawing. "You're lucky to have each other." As she turned to leave, Sophie looked up. "Do you want to see my picture? It's a dragon who breathes hot chocolate instead of fire." Vanessa hesitated, then smiled. "I'd love to." That brief exchange was the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Vanessa, they discovered, was a children's book illustrator who had been hiding her insecurities behind a facade of flirtation. Over time, she became a mentor to Sophie, nurturing her artistic talents and eventually helping her publish her first illustrated story at age 12. Life continued to surprise them. James found purpose in starting a support group for single parents, creating the community he had needed in those early days after Eliza's death. Sophie grew into a thoughtful, creative teenager who never lost her belief in the magic of small moments. And James? He eventually opened his heart again, finding love with someone who understood that his role as Sophie's father would always be central to his identity. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was rich with meaning and connection. On Sophie's 16th birthday, they returned to Riverside Café, now a beloved tradition. As they sat at their usual table, the same one Sophie had saved a decade earlier, she handed her father a wrapped package. "What's this?" James asked, surprised. "I'm supposed to be giving you gifts today." Sophie shrugged, suddenly shy. "Just open it." Inside was a leather-bound journal. James opened it to find page after page of Sophie's handwriting, interspersed with photographs and drawings. "It's our story," she explained. "All the important moments. I interviewed everyone, Mia, Mrs. Hernandez, even Vanessa. They all remembered that day, you know. What you said." James turned the pages slowly, seeing their life through his daughter's eyes. The challenges and triumphs, the ordinary days and special occasions, all woven together into a narrative of resilience and love. "There's a letter at the back," Sophie said quietly. James turned to the final pages and began to read. "Dear Dad. When I was little, I used to worry that our family wasn't complete because it was just the two of us. I remember asking you once if you were lonely, and you told me that loneliness isn't about how many people are in the room, it's about whether you can be your true self with them. I understand now what you meant. You've always been completely yourself with me, even when it would have been easier to pretend or to change to make other people comfortable. You taught me that standing in your truth isn't just about big moments of courage, it's a daily choice to live with integrity. That day at the cafe when I was 6, I didn't understand what happened, but I felt how the energy in the room changed. I felt how people looked at you differently afterward. Now I know why. In a world where people so often say what's convenient instead of what's true, you chose honesty. You chose me. Mom would be so proud of the life we've built. I know I am. Love always. Sophie." James looked up to find his daughter watching him, her hazel eyes, so like her mother's, bright with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick. "This is the greatest gift I've ever received." Sophie smiled. "Better than the macaroni picture frame from 2nd grade?" "Well, maybe tied with that," James laughed, reaching across to squeeze her hand. As they sat together in the warm afternoon light, surrounded by the gentle hum of cafe conversation, James reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that devastating Tuesday when his world had collapsed to this moment of quiet joy, the path had never been straight or easy. There had been days when grief felt insurmountable, when single parenthood seemed impossible, when loneliness cut deep. But there had also been countless moments of unexpected grace. The first time Sophie laughed after Eliza died, a sound so precious he'd had to leave the room to compose himself. The school play where she'd spotted him in the audience and given a tiny wave before delivering her lines perfectly. The night she'd crawled into his bed during a thunderstorm and whispered, "Don't worry, Daddy, I'll protect you too." Life rarely follows our carefully constructed blueprints. Sometimes it takes everything we thought we knew and rearranges it into something unrecognizable. But sometimes, if we're brave enough to embrace the new reality, we discover that what remains is more than enough. That family isn't defined by who's missing, but by who stays and how they love each other through the hardest days. In a crowded cafe years ago, James had stood in that truth. And everything that followed, the community they'd built, the lives they'd touched, The love they'd given and received, had grown from that.